Silakan, Prof.
Baik, good afternoon to all participants and welcome to the fourth sharing session organized by Department of English, Faculty of Humanities, Udayana University, in collaboration with Master and Doctor of Linguistics program and Center for Interdisciplinary Research on the Humanities and Social Sciences. So our agenda today is developing World English history, the death of standard English, the rise of local ways of speaking. So my great appreciation and thanks go to our speaker this afternoon, Dr. Howard Ment from Monash University, Australia, for taking the time to share his expertise with us. From the topic that we are going to talk today, it seemed to be a very interesting topic because, as we know, English has varieties among countries in the world. Like we have Indian English, Singaporean English, Philippine English, and can be Indonesian English. Hopefully, this meeting will give invaluable experience and yield satisfactory result for all participants as well as for our speaker. Finally, it is hoped that we all enjoy the seminar.
Okay. Thank you, Prof, for the kind introduction to our activity. And before we start, let me briefly introduce Howie. So it's our pleasure again to welcome Howie to our session on linguistics series. And Howie is a lecturer in linguistics at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. And he's also currently the coordinator of the undergraduate major in linguistics. And he was also my associate supervisor when I studied there. So Howie has a very close connection actually and interest in Indonesia and Indonesian languages, given his doctoral research was about youth language, colloquial Indonesian in Malang, and he also wrote a co-edited book about style and intersubjectivity in youth interactions. And he had 2-year experience teaching English for foreign languages here in Indonesia. So I don't want to take more time here as we are excited to learn from his talk about what English is. So let me share his slide. And Howie will say next. Yeah, Howie, to me. I will mute.
Yep.
Yeah, over to you, Howie. Thank you.
Okay, first, thank you for the very kind introduction and thank you for the invitation to speak to you today. This is a topic that is very close to my heart, but also Indonesia and the use of English is very close to my heart. As Gede said, I was an English teacher in East Java for 2 years, and in many ways, much of what I will talk about today is things that I wish I had known when I was teaching English. It's too late for my students, but hopefully not too late for yours. Next slide, please. So, if you take the IELTS or if you take the TOEFL, standard British or American English is typically the norm. Next slide. But beyond the IELTS, what is the reality of English to get today? Who speaks it? How is it spoken? Is standard English the safeguard of prestige and intelligibility that many people claim it is? Next slide, please. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin by deconstructing standard English. I'm going to break down what it means to speak a standard variety, and I'm going to talk about how the standard English that we use today came to be. Then I'm going to move outward into the world, and I'm going to continue to deconstruct the standard by looking at the grammar of world Englishes and what a collective look at the grammar of world Englishes tells us about the use of English today. Then I will do the same thing for pronunciation. What are those pronunciations that get used in the world Englishes today? Lastly, in terms of content sections, I'm going to talk about teaching world Englishes. When does it make sense to have somebody from the United States or Britain teaching English? And when does it make sense to have somebody locally teaching? Or rather, I should say, what are the pros and cons of each? And lastly, I hope this edges into a productive discussion. Next slide, please. So let's begin by deconstructing standard English. Next slide, please. What is standard language? What does it mean to speak a standard language? Well, the preferred standard form of a language is, from a formal point of view, just one of many dialects. It's a preferred selection of features from among all of the alternatives that are in use somewhere in a language community's territories. Next slide, please. So there has been an obsession with standards in language across history and across languages. One of the more famous examples of this is Latin, where there was a division between grammatica, which was the label used for proper Latin, and idioma, or las idiomas. And the idiomas were the vulgar forms of Latin spoken by the lesser people. These were actually the languages that went on to become French, Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese. So now, these days, we talk about standard French and standard Spanish and standard Italian, but in fact, at one time, these were non standard forms of Latin. Next slide, please. In English, the standard language variety is largely based on London English. And this is because by the end of the Middle English period, London was the political and economic center of England. Also, Caxton set up his printing press there. And in fact, this printing press was positioned just outside of Parliament in London. Next slide, please. So, if history had been different, if London hadn't been the political center and the cultural center of England around the time that we became concerned with standards, we might actually speak a standard variety or look to a standard variety like Birmingham English spoken by Ozzy Osbourne, or Liverpool English spoken by the Beatles, or Manchester English like that spoken by the Gallagher brothers of Oasis. Next slide, please. And the socio-historical happenstance of standard language is brought into contrast in other nations too. We find stories around standard language, and sometimes that standard language is elevated above other varieties that might have made more sense by looking at, for instance, Indonesia. Next slide, please. So, in fact, many years ago, or for a couple of hundred years, market Malays were spoken throughout the archipelago, this Bahasa Melayu Pasar. Next slide, please. But what happened when it came to actually codify and choose a language variety that would be used by people throughout the archipelago? The Dutch and local government and literary types thought that these local Pasar Malays were actually not worthy of standardization. Next slide, please. So what they did was they chose a single variety of Malay that was spoken in the Riau Johor Sultanate, and they elevated this form of Malay, and this ultimately, for various historical reasons, became declared to be the national language Indonesian. And in fact, the selection of this single variety of Malay Indonesian and the imposition of this variety on top of all the market Malays is one of the reasons why you still have a diglossic situation in Indonesia today. Next slide, please. This is further complicated by the fact that one market Malay, Jakarta Indonesian, which is a market Malay mixed in, as you would know, with elements of Balinese, but also elements of the Betawi people, has become popular in recent years. So once again, we're seeing a market Malay promoted throughout the archipelago, coming into competition in some instances with this Riau Johor Malay that was declared the Indonesian language, and into conflict again with local languages and also local varieties of Malay. Next slide, please. So back to English, right? We can see that socio-historical happenstance promotes certain varieties. Within English, there was an obsession with fixing and refining the language from the 18th century. People didn't really care what variety you chose that much until the 18th century. But from 1750 to 1800, there were over 200 works on grammar. Most famous among these works was the Bishop Robert Loth's short introduction to English grammar. And you would be surprised, perhaps, to find out that Loth's grammar is responsible for many of those grammatical rules that we take to be given in almost godly standard English rules today. But it's important to remember, as my colleague Kate Burridge points out, that to create a standard language or to build a garden is to enter into a partnership with natural processes. Languages and gardens are never finished products. Next slide, please. And Nick Kuplin, the great sociolinguist Nick Kuplin, points out that standardization is actually an ongoing process of suppressing variation and a drive toward uniformity against the backdrop of all of this variation throughout the world. Ultimately, we as linguists know that language is never fixed. We alter the way that we speak depending on where we are, who we're speaking to, what our attitude is toward a topic, or what our attitude is toward the person that we're speaking to. Next slide, please. Now, whoop, back one. Can you go back one slide? Oh, and forward. Cool. So this brings me to the point that I want to make today, that ultimately we've had hundreds of years of looking to standard English for socio and historical reasons, but now what we're seeing are growing numbers of users of non-standard English. And this raises the question, to what degree should we change the way that we view language? Next slide, please. Because these days, over 2 billion people speak English to varying degrees. And if you notice, only 320 to 380 million of those people are native speakers. Equaling that or greater than that, we see that there are an estimated 350 to 500 million fluent English as a second language speakers, and an estimated 100 million fluent English as a foreign language speakers. So on top of that, many English as a foreign language speakers who are not necessarily fluent, but are competent perhaps in the language. This means that we're seeing a change. Next slide. And as I said, note throughout this that the sheer number of non-standard English speakers, because even among these millions of native English speakers are many more non-standard English speakers than standard English speakers, causes us to definitely rethink the way we think about language. Next slide, please. The sheer weight of the standard and the non-standard users mean that we have to rethink this. Next slide. Among other things, we're seeing growing use of China English and Chinglish, and historically these varieties were viewed as perhaps lesser varieties, but increasingly China English is being used in university campuses in China. Entire courses are being taught in English. Next slide. And of course, throughout ASEAN and throughout the European Union, English is often used as a lingua franca. It is the language, the official main language of ASEAN. It is the implicit official, it's one of many official languages in the EU, but it is a language used by many within the EU. Next slide, please. So what does this mean about prestige, you probably wonder? Standard English still has prestige. Ultimately, this is arbitrary, remember. The way that we feel about languages are often arbitrary. If you ask an English person about English in Birmingham, they will tell you that English in Birmingham is terrible. If you ask an American about English in Birmingham, all they know is that it's a British accent, and I love British accents. Next. What about intelligibility, though? Because many people argue that standard English is necessary for intelligibility. Well, that's what the rest of today is about. Let's talk about English intelligibility and social meaning in the 21st century. Next slide. First, let's look at grammar and patterns in the grammar of world Englishes. Next slide. So you often come across these rules that should not be broken in standard Englishes. For instance, never end a sentence with a preposition. Now, you might not know that many of these rules are entirely arbitrary. This rule in particular can be attributed to the Bishop Loth, who I mentioned a moment ago. Next slide. We obsess over standard English rules, but to what degree do they actually reflect English use these days? Next slide. Well, Kortman and Smrexanyi set out to identify the most frequent grammatical features in non-standard varieties of English worldwide. They examined 46 Englishes in 7 regions throughout the world in search of the most commonly occurring features. And I thought to establish the relevance of non-standard English, we could look at the 12 most commonly occurring features. Next. And as we go through this, keep track of how many of these you're guilty of using, how many of these might be associated with Indonesian English. So first is a lack of inversion in main clause yes, no questions. So instead of do you get the point, you would just say you get the point with a rising intonation. Me instead of I in coordinate subjects. So me and my brother were late rather than my brother and I. Never used as a past tense negator. He never did it, meaning he didn't do it. Adverbs are the same form as adjectives, so come quick rather than come quickly. Next. Number 5, absence of plural marking after measure nouns. So 4 pound, 5 year. Here you probably recognize this one as a feature that you might come across in Indonesia. Lack of inversion, lack of auxiliaries in WH questions. So what you doing instead of what are you doing? Multiple negation or negative concord. So he won't do no, won't know rather than just a single he won't do harm. Number 8, degree modifier adverbs lacking ly. That's real good rather than that's really good. Next. Whoops. There we go. The other thing is the special forms of phrases for second person plural pronouns. So for multiple people, we might use rather than just you, use y'all, you uns, you guys, you fella, as you might come across in Eastern Nusantara. Leveling of the difference between present, perfect, and simple past. Some of us have been years ago. This is one, once again, that you might see in Indonesia. Double comparatives and superlatives. That's so much more easier to follow. Irregular use of articles. I had nice garden. I had the toothache. Once again, these are forms that you might find in Indonesia. Why do these forms matter, right? Why do these prevalent forms matter? Well, they matter because these days English proficiency might impact the way that some people view professional competency. So click please. So a doctor might say to you, Hughes is going to die in a year, and someone might see that as a bad thing. A doctor might say, tooth hurt much more badly. You have toothache. I seen it. Next click. Or the bankers might say, Use yin's looking for a loan. Thy loans at this bank are awfully dear. That's Scottish Doric English. Next slide. So the question that I want to ask at the end of this first section, since we obsess over standard English and using these standard English forms, is look, the weightage of usage might suggest the relevance of non-standard English, but we're still hung up on the standard. If you look throughout the world, people are using non-standard features more than standard features, but we're still obsessing over the standard. But should we be? Next slide, please. And that brings me to pronunciation, right? Because when we think of pronunciation and grammar, these are those core bits that we obsess over, but also our teachers obsess over in the classroom. So I begin with one of those notoriously difficult sounds to make when we're learning English, the th sound or the sound. And our teachers spend a lot of time teaching us that sound. Look at the sentence in number 5 here. The Smiths wear thin clothes throughout the winter months. Try to say it, and it's rough. Now, the interesting thing about this sound, though, is even though it's one of those features that our teachers obsess over, this is a very rare sound in the world's languages. Less than 10% of the world's languages actually have a th and the sound. And this has implications for some of what I'm about to talk about. Next slide, please. We obsess over standard English pronunciation in the classroom, but to what degree does this reflect English use the world over? Let's look deeper. So, we're finding more in our investigations of English as a lingua franca is that the general trend is that English is used by fewer native speakers. As I said, it's the de facto lingua franca of ASEAN. It's also implicitly the de facto lingua franca of the EU, though you will find French being used prominently in the EU too. Um, so it's also the lingua franca of airplane speak and sea speak. Next slide, please. Oop, next slide. Whoop, sorry, back. I messed up. Okay, so this has led to a growing interest in English as a lingua franca. What we're finding is it's no longer ideas around proficiency, and it's definitely not ideas around standard that matter as much, but rather intelligibility. And there's a really important thing happening here. Historically, we thought about the standard as equaling intelligibility, and the study of English throughout the world is telling us that the two are not necessarily related, and sometimes using standard English is less intelligible. So English as a lingua franca research has historically included a focus on problematic structures and pronunciations. And in doing so, in investigating these things, we've been able to identify an English as a lingua franca core. Next slide, please. Now, one of the key researchers in identifying, firstly, investigating English as a lingua franca, but secondly, identifying a lingua franca core is Jennifer Jenkins. Her approach is predominantly concerned with phonology, and she's identified a core set of phonological features that are shared by English as a lingua franca set of users. Jenkins argues that the lingua franca core sounds pronunciations are more relevant to non-native speakers and should be more relevant in the non-native speaker classroom. She argues this point by reviewing speakers and finding that variation in the lingua franca core did not impact intelligibility. So what we can see in looking at this is we can identify that there are certain features that we should focus on in the EFL and the ESL context. Next slide, please. So, what are those lingua franca core features? Those features that should or should not be taught in the classroom. First, consonants. Teaching consonant segments are important, except for the interdental fricatives that I spoke about. You can use, rather than the and you can use t and d, and people will still understand you. The other consonant segment that does not matter is differences in L. So in English, you might know that there are different L pronunciations. One is toward the front of the mouth, as in like, and another one is in the back of the mouth, milk. So the tongue is up towards the back. You don't have to focus on that milk pronunciation. You can use any L pronunciation and your speaker will get it. There is a preference, or rather it is easier to understand R sounds, American pronunciations of these R sounds in words, rather than to not include the words. So Americans would pronounce a word like part with the R sound, where a British speaker would use pot. The American pronunciation of the R is the preferred one. British T sounds between vowels are more important than the American flaps. So, for instance, in a word like butter, you should pronounce the T rather than I would naturally do it as butter. People might get confused. Word initial clusters should be pronounced. It's important to say the pr and the str. The other thing we come across is it is more important to pronounce or insert sounds even than to drop sounds. Next. The lingua franca core also tells us that in terms of vowels, there are many vowel pronunciations that don't matter, but one pronunciation that does matter is the long-short distinction. So the pronunciation of leave versus live, this kind of distinction matters, but a lot of the other vowel sounds don't matter. It's important to recognize that English actually has a much wider vowel system than many other languages, and because of that, this means that we don't have to focus on all of the vowels, but some of the vowels matter. So the other thing is that if there is variation between different varieties, American English versus British English, or in Australia, we might talk about the difference between more sophisticated or cultivated users or lower language users, it's okay to have that variation, but that variation needs to be consistent. The other vowel, and one of the only vowels that truly matters in English, is this Australian pronunciation of the word bird as bed. This bed vowel, if you don't use it, people won't understand you. Next. So Jenkins proposes that what matters even more, though, than pronunciation is accommodation skills. And what this means is, rather than teaching people canned pronunciation, having your students endlessly try to pronounce the th sound in class is actually teaching your students to recognize what sounds other people are using and being able to accommodate and try to understand those sounds, and where you can adopt those sounds. So what this typically means is first being taught the English as a lingua franca core, and then an expanded set of features to accommodate to native speakers or non-native speakers, depending on what that learner needs. Now, what's happening here too is that Jenkins isn't proposing that we abandon the teaching of all of these sounds. What Jenkins is in fact proposing is that we first learn the lingua franca core, and then after that we think about the goals of our students. What do they need to know? It's worth noting that Jenkins' work is based in Europe, but it also is relevant to Asia. It's relevant to Southeast Asia. It's relevant to Indonesia. Next slide, please. And yeah, it should be noted in closing in our discussion, in light of the historical emphasis on standard English, that in fact non-standard pronunciations can actually assist intelligibility. So the standard English pronunciation of a word like officially is more difficult to understand than a non-standard pronunciation of this word. So officially is easier to understand than officially. Next slide, please. So that's grammar. That's pronunciation. Let's talk about the implications for teaching world Englishes. Next slide. So when we talk about teaching world Englishes, we typically talk about teaching world Englishes in terms of an exonormative model or an endonormative model. So, an exonormative model typically promotes this idea that the native speaker is best. And what I mean by native speaker is it's very, very narrow. Native speaker here is referring to teachers from Australia or the United States or Britain. And notably, here, when we talk about native speakers, we're not talking about speakers from places like Singapore. Typically, a native speaker from Singapore for this exonormative model is not often considered to be a native speaker. A Filipino native speaker of English is not considered to be elevated to this exonormative model, this native speaker is best model. An endonormative model is the local teacher is best. So this idea that the best person within Indonesia to be teaching you English is in fact a fluent English-speaking Indonesian. I also wanted to note that there's a third model called the lingua franca model, which is embedded within multilingualism. I'm going to put that aside for today, but I'm happy to answer any questions about it. Next slide. So, the exonormative model. This has historically been accepted as the most legitimate and prestigious model. It's codified and its materials are spread throughout the world. We see this model spread from the British Council to English First, which is who I used to work for, or the International House. Now, many governments and many businesses adopt this model because they want to be seen as providing the best for their people. Next. And there are any number of advantages to an exonormative model for those inside and outside of the country. Look, first, it's beneficial for English speakers and the industries that promote them. So perhaps at the outset, we might even be a bit skeptical of this. It is beneficial to those students who plan to live in the inner circle. So if you're planning to live in Britain, if you're planning to live in Australia, then you would benefit from a model like this because it will ease your transition. Of course, this model is also important for those students who wish to take the TESOL or the IELTS. Next. But there are a number of potential problems in adopting an exonormative model. In many instances, the demand for native speakers outstrips availability. And once again, the caveat here, and this is problematic, is that native speakers are typically thought of as being British or American and not Singaporean or the Philippines. And that's why perhaps that's one more thing that needs to be thought through here. And what this means is sometimes schools are reduced to recruit unqualified teachers. So ultimately, you're just going out and you're trying to find anyone who could speak this variety, not necessarily somebody who is qualified to teach it. Native speakers often command higher salaries, and this leads to higher costs in courses. Research shows that Korean families actually spend upward of 1/3 of their salaries on English and music courses for their kids because these exonormative models and exonormative teachers are so expensive. Next. The exonormative model also disadvantages local teachers in any number of ways. The teachers become, within these international schools, resentful because the exonormative model devalues local varieties and also because of the higher salaries of native, often unqualified teachers. In some private English schools, you'll find that these unqualified teachers are making 5 times what the local teachers are making. Local teacher expertise as fellow English learners and bilinguals isn't tapped into. Some of these exonormative external teachers are not even bilingual or multilingual or knowing about the local language variety. Next. Yeah, and these local teachers actually have grammatical knowledge of both languages, and underemployment, meaning not being used to their full extent, can actually impact the students negatively. The other thing that happens by introducing an exonormative teacher into the local context is that students may become disadvantaged and disheartened because they will never achieve the first language success of that exonormative teacher. You will never, past a certain age, or I should say, it is statistically highly, highly unlikely that you will ever sound like an American or a British person if you're learning language after what's called the critical period. So if students and teachers see the second language as a battle that they're fated to never win, it's little wonder that they become dispirited. Now, Andy Kirkpatrick has argued, with regard to the benefit of students who plan to live, study, or work in the inner circle, that it's important to remember that only a small number of students go on to do that. And in fact, many of our English learners are once again learning English to operate in international context, speaking with other non-native speakers. So we obsess over teachers from overseas, but are there better solutions closer to home? Next slide. Well, let's look at the endonormative model. Local teachers are greatly advantaged by this model. It empowers the students and, where relevant, the local variety. The multilingual ability of the students or teachers is fully capitalized in the classroom. They're familiar with the grammars of both English and local language. Teachers can bring a second language user situation and roll into the classroom based on their own experience. So rather than focusing on native speakers giving hypothetical examples of how you will communicate in English, a local teacher can tell you how it is likely that you will communicate in English with other non-native speakers. Next, the schools benefit from an endonormative model because it is cheaper. In theory, if you think about that, I said a moment ago that sometimes these external teachers can make 5 times what a local teacher makes. That means you can invest in more training for the local teacher. You can hire more local teachers. You can give them higher salaries. You can invest in more materials in theory. The other thing that comes up is there's less risk of the imposition of foreign cultural values in the local environment. This is also useful in thinking about teaching students too. Sometimes some introduction of the foreign cultural values is useful, but other times it can be useful to introduce the language using the local values so they're more accessible to people. Students are advantaged because they're given achievable goals. As I said, if you put a fluent speaker of English from Indonesia in front of an Indonesian classroom, the students can see a level that they are likely to achieve. Also, they will recognize that that teacher has multi-competency in, not just English, but in fact English, Balinese, Indonesian, Javanese. They can see that this is an achievable thing that they can have. Cook points out that there's no reason why the second language component of multi-competence should be identical to the monolingual's first language. And this is one of those reasons why it makes sense to have a local teacher. Next. So that brings me up here at the end to a discussion. Next slide. So Cook has pointed out the goal of second language use has to be adapted to the wishes and aspirations of our actual students. And even if we as teachers hope that the students will be less rigid in their views about what a second language learner actually means, we still have to remember that our students have goals. We have to think about these goals. For now, in this point in history, the degree to which what I've spoken about here will be relevant to you will be influenced by your goals or the goals of your students. Next. But in the future, and this is what I will set up for discussion here, you may be able to drive the paradigm shift. And I ask a series of questions here for you to think about as you go on to drive this paradigm shift. Why promote the IELTS or the TOEFL if standard English and standard English speakers are not the norm? They are increasingly not the norm now, and they will increasingly not be the norm in the future. Next, why promote standard English pronunciation if it might actually make intelligibility more difficult? Because this is indeed what research shows us, that sometimes promoting standard pronunciation is not what other people are using. Next, Why promote rigid standards, rigid grammatical standards, rigid standards overall, where interactional understanding and accommodation are arguably more important? And this is one of those areas where English as a lingua franca speakers are much better than Native American or Native British speakers, because often you are used to speaking to other non-native speakers. You are used to speaking to others, and you are used to accommodating, asking for clarification, knowing in second language acquisition when to let something go. Native American English speakers, Native British English speakers, and so on are not as good at that as you are. Research shows us. So I'll end by saying, look, if an American or British or an Australian English speaker comes to Indonesia, shouldn't they be accommodating to Indonesian English? Shouldn't they be accommodating to your communication norms rather than you accommodating to their norms? Ultimately, when it comes to speaking English, the stats tell us that the future of English is yours. And I look forward to answering any questions and discussing the topic with you.
Okay, so thank you, Hui, for the spirited and engaging presentation. So now I will first give a chance to our Vice Dean here, Bapak Nyoman Arya Wibawa, because he will have meeting shortly to ask first and directly to Howie. Silakan Pak Arya.
Thank you, Pak Dede. So, Professor Howard Mann, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, expertise, and experience with us. So it's very interesting. The topic is very interesting, and I'm quite happy to see that you bring implications to, let's say, the localizations of standard English into varieties of English across the globe. It is more interesting when you touch the issue of the implications of that localizations to phonological level, grammatical level. But one thing that I would like to ask you, the implications of, let's say, nativizations of standard English or localizations of standard English across the globe, especially when we are, talking about the pragmatic aspects of English. So let's say now, so we have, so many kinds of Englishes. Let's say Singaporean English, Malaysian English, we have Indian English, Sri Lankan English. So what I'm thinking of is, well, because English is spreading out to become nativized or localized, then it might bring implications to the pragmatic aspects of the English itself. So because pragmatic is culture specific, so it might be that we have like localized or nativized pragmatics. And then you have to think about how to teach this localized or nativized pragmatic. So let's say to be more specific, so back channeling, for example, both linguistic, non-linguistic back channeling in pragmatic aspect. So that should be very interesting in the nativizations of standard English into localized English, nativized English across the globe. So do you think that there is any effect of pragmatic level of localization of standard English into the varieties of English across the globe? And how are you gonna fix these kind of issues, let's say in countries where English is not the standard English?
Firstly, thank you for your question. That's a wonderful question, and the beautiful thing about this question is it directly addresses the model that I didn't talk about, the English as a lingua franca model, and it also directly intersects with some of the lingua franca core elements that I didn't talk about today. So thank you for asking a question that enables us to engage with that. Because isn't pragmatic so difficult to deal with even within a single language and even between English speakers within a single variety? And what happened alongside of Jennifer Jenkins' work, Larry Smith was doing work. Larry Smith and another colleague was doing work that promoted this idea that linguistic forms didn't matter. They didn't matter as much as actually what we were doing with language. Of course, that famous Austin perspective that what language means doesn't matter as much as what language does. And Larry Smith and colleagues were arguing that we should find some way to be able to teach these pragmatic features, and that we should take these pragmatic features as a starting point. And that, in fact, rather than teaching words and rather than teaching pronunciations, what we should be doing is thinking about, for instance, speech acts, and starting off and saying, well, how does an Indonesian English speaker do a request? And how does that relate to the way that an Indian English speaker or a Singaporean English speaker can do requests? And this, in turn, was actually, as Bapak probably knows, that this was taken up by scholars within English as an international language, and by scholars within English as an international language, and those scholars who promote cultural linguistics. And the idea of cultural linguistics and English as an international language is, in fact, to turn the form-function paradigm on its head and to begin to think about not just how the linguistic forms are used, but in fact, actually to think once again, well, how can we frame schemas? How can we say, when we think about politeness in Persian, Persian is, and by Persian English speakers, is guided by a cultural schema called tahruf. How can we compare this to Indonesian speakers who might be guided by sopan or something similar? Now, as Bapak actually clearly outlines, which is important, is how do we teach this? It's so hard. The forms are always so much easier to teach. So the question suddenly becomes, do we start with a classroom that focuses on the end function of language, or do we continue to teach the forms but then add the pragmatics afterward? And I've seen a lot of ideas around this, but I'm often left unsatisfied. So if you have any suggestions, I would love to hear them, because I myself am always confused by this very aspect of global Englishes. Pragmatics is very important, but how do we convey pragmatics? How do we teach pragmatics as the core component of the differences between English? I have to confess that I'm often, when I think about this in very practical terms, just very confused, Pop. So
Right.
I don't know that I have an answer for you, but I think that
So, the point that I was just asking, to just, hit my head, So I was thinking of pragmatic aspect and then how we should teach it,
Yeah.
So in particular, in the aspects of back channeling, so you are familiar with, really in the process of talking, doing conversation, right? Then let's assume now we have, Indian English then. And then, or let's say Sri Lankan English. Then, what happens with really in standard English, in, let's say, Indian English, and, but there's going to be, so many varieties of, let's say, pragmatic aspects of English, because, the English is nativified. But, just came up to my mind and I was, sharing with you. But excellent presentation. So I think that should be the thing that I'm expecting from you. Thank you so much, Professor Man.
And thank you, Bapak.
Ya, Pak Dede, saya izin duluan ya.
Ya, terima kasih Pak Arya sudah bertanya dan datang di acara kali ini. Okay, Howie, thanks for the answer. Now let me share screen to show you questions from the chat so that it's easier for you to read that.
Okay.
So the first we have from Bapak Sena here. How do we see Indonesian back in the day as elevated Malay? Is it through force, social cultural context by the Dutch, or is it in its actual linguistic properties? Yeah. So he is curious about how and why Dutch established this elevated Malay.
Oh goodness, I could talk all day about this. Um, um,
Yeah.
yeah, historically, and apologies. I think that of course your esteemed audience would know this history too. That so you had the market Malays being used, and in many colonial situations, what would happen is the lingua franca established would be French or Spanish, depending on the colony. But the Dutch preferred not to speak Dutch to the Indonesian for various reasons. Many of them, which were inappropriate. So what happened in the first instance was that the Dutch chose this variety just because they thought that it was esteemed. It was an arbitrary choice, to be honest. It was we can suspect why they thought it was. Often longer language varieties are viewed to be words with longer words or languages with longer words are sometimes viewed to be more sophisticated languages. Um, the form of Malay that they spoke from Riau Johor was spoken by the Sultanate, and whenever language varieties are spoken by people perceived to be prestigious, they gain prestige too. It was different. The Riau Johor Malay was different from the other Malay varieties, and difference is another factor that makes something seem prestigious. So that was the first step. The second step was that whenever Indonesians began writing, the Mulai Pustaka was set up in Sumatra, and when it was set up in Sumatra, people began to write in that Malay variety because it had that esteem. And by the time it got to the to the to 1928, when Indonesia declared their national language, it made sense because it was actually probably the only Malay variety that was codified in any way, because the Dutch had promoted it. The first Indonesian writers had written literature in it, and because of it, there was only really it was the only Malay that was actually viewed to be just existing on written paper. I mean, there were local newspapers that were writing in the local Pasar Malay, but that Riau Johor Malay certainly had a lot of currency, and it was being spoken by many sophisticated Indonesians at the time. In the burgeoning nation too. Yeah, so a lot of it is just historical happenstance, and yeah, to go back to the beginning of why it was chosen, it was quite simply associated with sophisticated people who were perceived to be sophisticated, so it had prestige because of it. But also, there might be some aspects of, we're just drawn to languages with longer words. We're drawn to languages that have lots of sophisticated older words into it. So, where in English, we view lots of Latin and French borrowed words as being sophisticated. In Indonesian, a lot of the more baku and sophisticated Indonesian words are actually based in Sanskrit, Bahasa Sanskrit. So there's a bit of that. So thanks for the question. I hope I answered it.
Okay. Thanks, Zoe. I'm now going to the next. A bit of hectic here.
Okay. Great.
All right. So we have two questions from Bapak Nyoman Udayana. So the first one is this.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good one. So this one would be sixth I mean, we wouldn't 1/6. We wouldn't actually, in most instances, say the S on the end of this. So what we would typically have is we'd have the k, th, and s, sixth. But what I would first, I mean, it would be pronounced sixth. So with these three sounds together. Now, what I would add to this, though, is in the lingua franca core, we talked about consonant clusters being important at the start of words. They're not important at the end of words, actually. So I can understand that you would want to pronounce this correctly, but this is one of those sounds that Jennifer Jenkins would actually suggest isn't important, at least in the beginning of what you're doing. And beyond that point, if you do want to pronounce these things, honestly, there's the only way I think to get around to it is sometimes just by doing tongue twisters or trying to put it in different parts of words. But yeah, at the end of words, it's really hard. It's just genuinely practicing, trying to come up with tongue twisters. But honestly, um, in line with the presentation that I gave today, this isn't really an important sound in the very beginning. It's not really. I understand the motivation for wanting to use the standard pronunciation, but Jennifer Jenkins would say, don't stress about it in the beginning.
All right. Thanks, Howie. So let's go back. Go on with this from Bapak Udayana again. So this would be in words. Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, loan words, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is a really yep. This is a really interesting question, and yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the beauty. To be honest, that's the beauty of English wherever it goes in the world, is that wherever English goes in the world, it tends to adapt loan words. It tends to integrate loan words. Australia is actually a great example of that. I think G'day can speak to this point, that Australia has a distinct vocabulary that can be very different from the kinds of English that's spoken in Britain and the US. And one of the reasons why is that Australia has integrated a lot of local words, but also we've created new words for our local experience. So, you can sometimes come down here and not know what somebody is talking about because they're using lots of different words and shortenings. I don't know. Did it confuse you, G'day, hearing all of this?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Especially and also the word choice.
But to get to the point here, what's beautiful again is the shades of meaning point. And with the shades of meaning point, when we look at English and the way that English has developed throughout history, we've got a lot of core words that go back to Anglo-Saxon usage. So we're talking about the use of English before the 12th century. And then after the 12th century, English integrated a bunch of words from Latin or rather from French, and then after that into the 15th, 16th century, English integrated a bunch of words from Latin, but also French and also Greek. And what ends up happening is we've got multiple words within English that actually convey the same idea, but different shades of the same idea, kind of like your examples here. But an example that always comes to my mind here is the example of climb. You might climb a mountain, which is a good old Anglo-Saxon word, but you might also ascend a mountain. And ascend is a good French word, and they have different nuances in English. So if you climb a mountain, you can climb a mountain or you can climb a wall. It's a very low scale kind of thing. It entails this kind of gritty experience. But if you ascend a mountain, that's this more triumphant, big thing. I ascended the mountain, and I ascended Mount Everest versus I climbed Mount Everest. There's shades of different meaning there. And your examples here, the difference between drinkable versus potable, there's shades. Both of these are actually, if I'm not mistaken, Anglo-Saxon words focusing on drinkable or potable, but the shade of different meaning here is potable actually means will it get you sick, whereas drinkable just means, well, it could mean get you sick, but also it could refer to taste. So these shades of meaning are all wrapped up, and I agree, wherever English goes, it takes in new vocabulary, and that makes it special in the local environment. Even in Malaysian English, in Malaysian English, you don't typically say eat in most instances. You end up saying makan because that's a word that people borrowed to try to keep. So thanks for the question. I hope I answered.
All right. Thanks, Owi. So now I will let a direct question from Professor Ngasudipa to ask you before we go back to a chat questions. Okay. Silakan, Prof.
Thank Dede. It is clear. Hello?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep. Yes. We can hear the
Well,
voice.
and this presentation. May I introduce myself? I graduated 33 years ago. I was there between 1984 until 1987. I learned the topic is very promising to do in the future. I believe, especially when you talk about English as lingua franca and 12 most common vernacular universal. After I listened your comprehensive presentation, you said World English, Standard English. May I compare with minimal English? Why? Because I found the goal of minimal English is to provide non-experts with a framework that assists in clear expression and clear thinking, leading to communication that is truly cross-translated. This particularly relevant for international organization, for anyone working with migrant, and indeed in many other fields. What do you think about this? Because I'm very interested in doing such field. Thank you, Prof.
Well, first, thank you for your question, Pat, and thank you for joining the presentation. So, yeah, I think that it's promising. I know that Cliff Goddard and other people working in natural semantic metalanguage have begun to work with this idea of minimal English, and I think that it enjoys some promise. One of the beautiful things about NSM, natural semantic metalanguage, is that it tries to provide this cross-cultural frame. It tries to give us this ideological and metalinguistic way of explaining the similarities in human communication. I think that it definitely includes some promise, and I think that Cliff Goddard would be excited to know that you would be working within this frame, and I'm fairly certain that he's just done a collection of papers on minimal English. So I would even encourage you to get in touch with Cliff to let him know that you're interested in this concept. I don't know enough about it to speak as an authority, but I can definitely say that at the outset, it provides an interesting and innovative way of looking at this issue. And once again, even the very concept of minimal English is pointing us in the right direction of making sure that we're considering that we're not overteaching students or pointing students in the wrong direction, where in fact their goals are I don't even want to say more modest, but their goals should be more measured toward the context in which they might find themselves. So thank you for raising the idea of minimal English. And yeah, I would encourage you to get in touch with Cliff, because I think he would be inspired that you were considering to think about English in Indonesia through a minimal English frame.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. I'm very
Thank you.
happy with. Thank you, Prof.
Okay, Howie. We still have more questions. So here is from Bapak Ketut Wandia for you. Can you see the
Totally.
slide? Yeah.
Yep. This is so complicated. This is wonderful. Firstly, thank you, Pa, for your kind words. But secondly, yeah, this is very complicated, and it's complicated on so many levels, even beyond the idea of standard English. So, as an example of this, I know that even within Australia, when native English speakers from Africa have applied for jobs and they've not gotten the jobs because they have English that has an accent from East Africa, for instance, from Kenya or Tanzania or from the Sudan. And what happens is people hear that they have an accent, and already the attitudes that they have toward the person are that, well, maybe this person doesn't understand English. This sometimes comes through even in our attitudes toward accents or second language speakers of language, even if that person is fluent in a language. In fact, sometimes people presume that they're not, or they judge that they can't understand that person just based on their face, even, let alone not on their accent. So it definitely creates issues. The other issue that is really interesting here is that sometimes, even where a person knows the words and they can speak English, this goes back to the early, if they're not familiar with the pragmatic cues, if they're not familiar with how to use English, if they're not familiar with, how to make small talk, or how to look for the real meaning of the person's question, then sometimes they might find that they are disadvantaged in the job interview. So this is an issue. That's why part of this story, I think, part of the World English's story is one about convincing people that these non-standard language varieties matter, or to go back to use that term that we just mentioned, minimal English strategies. What we're doing is we're talking about the teaching and learning of forms, but also what we're doing is we're trying to change the ideologies, the attitudes that people hold toward English speakers, Now, the very simple, with all of that kind of discussing around this particular topic, I think the simple answer to a very packed and interesting and complex question is it would depend on the job. Because, if you were going for a job where, in Australia, for instance, where clarity of communication would be viewed as a really important factor, then you might run into trouble if you weren't speaking what would be considered standard Australian English. But I'm aware, and probably G'day and other people who have studied in Australia are aware of people who get jobs who don't necessarily feel competent in Australian English, but in fact you end up working with other people who are speakers of English from, the Philippines or India or other places. I mean, even here in Melbourne, I have a friend from East Timor who works in a cafe, and he ends up actually using Indian English, and he ends up speaking English with, what was the other one? Indian English and Middle Eastern Englishes, and because of it, they're not even using standard English. So what would probably matter most is actually that, the job in question.
Okay. Thank you. So I think this is the last chat, the last question from the chats, the last two from Arafik.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Oh, this is a great question. Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Pat. Thank you so much for this question. The idea of localizing English is good for non-native speakers, but it's not good for natives. Good. I think the simple answer is good. I think that native speakers need to try harder, um, because my honest answer is that native speakers often historically have not all native speakers, but I think that frequently in international business and international exchange, that native speakers have often not tried hard enough to accommodate non-native speakers. I think that native speakers often rely too heavily on being monolingual and having a monolingual mindset. And I think that in international context, I actually think that native speakers should try harder to within international context. And for your next question, there might be, but let's see. Yep. Um, I think, yeah, I mean, each, for the second point about Indonesian speakers, I think that, I think that what ends up happening is you need to decide locally, or the community needs to come to an understanding locally about what makes sense, what makes the most sense as the local lingua franca. I think in most instances, Indonesian or some variety of Indonesian would make sense as the local lingua franca. Um, I'm aware of some places in Indonesia where English does function as a lingua franca. You will come across places in Jakarta where some people will speak English, and maybe some of you know of places where that might happen. But generally, my impression, and you tell me because it's your context. I'm not here to prescribe, but I would think that Indonesian in most instances makes sense as the lingua franca in yeah, many if not most instances. Yeah, thanks for the question, but I'm also keen to hear your thoughts on that because indeed it's your context.
Okay, thanks, Howie. We have one more question that went through a private chat, so let me paste in here. Um, oh, sorry,
Yep,
24 maybe. From Bapak Hairil Anwar here.
great.
Okay,
Thanks. How to educate into the yep. Yeah, that's a fantastic question actually. I mean, I would hope that, in fact, the kind of information that I've talked about here would be useful for being able to argue against some of those ideologies. You know, the thing I'm aware of people making fun of President Jokowi's Javanese English, but yeah, I mean, there's so much layered on top of layer there, isn't there? I mean, because in a way, we're making fun of his Javanese English contains some new order ideologies in a way. You know, that idea that the local doesn't belong in international spheres. Um, so, sorry, yeah, I have to unpack the question in my head a little bit here. Um, so, thinking about this directly, I would first suggest that the information in this presentation, I hope, would help to argue against that local ways of speaking matter. But the second thing that I would add there is, a lot of the younger kids, the really smart young kids like G'day and other people like him, and even the younger kids again, are actually seeing a revival of local identity. So I don't know, in East Java at least, people are prouder of their Javanese accents than they were 10 years ago. And they're prouder again of their Javanese accents than they were 20 years ago. So maybe time, maybe in time, younger people will become more comfortable with this accent and more comfortable with this accent even being in English. So yeah, I hope I hope that the ideas contained in this presentation, but also time will change that, and that people will be, lebih terbuka about Bapak President. I would hope. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Howie. So I don't know, maybe there is one more question. If not, we could end the sessions. Yeah, no one, I think, seems to ask more question. So I think that's it. The end of the session for today. So thank you, Howie, for your time. It's like what, 5 p.m. should be a break time in Melbourne. So um, on behalf of our department as well as the faculty here, so we thank Howie for your time. Presentation very spirited. So I miss that kind of talk from you. So also to the participants who make their time for this session, we cannot thank you enough for that. So I hope we can see you again in the next session. And yeah, I think that's it. Thank you. Hope to see you in the next session. Bye bye.
I hope so too, and thank you to everybody who came to listen. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed talking to you, and I hope it was useful. Take care, everyone. Hati hati.
Yeah.